So yesterday was just a lecture, and I'm not going to repeat much of it, and I just kind of tried to place Nonie Jabavu in context, and we spoke a bit about her readership. Is it too loud? Is it fine? Okay. We spoke about the readership and who would have been interested in her work, both in South Africa and abroad. And it's been really great just having conversations with people after the lecture and just before, of people who bought the books and have their own copies still. We spoke a bit about how her books are currently unavailable, and some of us are trying to work on getting her columns published. And echo. So I don't know how we can adjust this. Should I try speak without it? Yeah, maybe. Okay, how's that? Is it still echoing? Do you want to move forward maybe? I don't know. Is it okay? Okay, thanks. Pardon? Oh no, that was because I was holding it in my hand. Okay. So today I thought we could start with, I showed the cover of the Ebony magazine article that would have come out announcing that she was the New Strand editor, and I just thought just to give a sense of who she was, just to recap. So this is a really cool picture of her with her personal secretary, Kathleen Anscombe, who was taking dictation from her boss. Besides her native Xhosa language, English editor speaks French and Swahili. And interestingly, I found book reviews of both of her books, some in Italian and some in French. I'm still trying to find someone to translate them, but that's besides the point. But it kind of gives us a sense of her own interest in language. We spoke a bit about that yesterday, but also who was she in terms of building her own global identity. And for someone who speaks French and Swahili, it tells us about how she moves around in the world. And then another picture with editor Connie George and magazine's co-owner Ernest Kay. And then I like the comment, Miss Jabavu's appointment stirred mild sensation. So again, this idea that she had caused a stir and she was, making a mark in history. And these are just pictures of her in London with her daughter Thembi, who many people haven't been quite able to trace. Thembi apparently had a son who is supposedly in America, but there's been very little effort in trying to trace him and kind of connect him to the family heritage in order to keep the legacy alive. But I'm just going to read the blurbs at the bottom. So although married to film director Michael Cadbury Crossfield, scion of a wealthy English Quaker family, she still uses her maiden name Jabavu and the title Miss as a pen name in her personal life. And then with her daughter Thembi above, editor spends off-duty hours strolling through London's famed Hyde Park. Born in England during World War II, Thembi, a secretary, is offspring of her mother's first marriage to Royal Air Force man who was killed in action. And then this is just pictures of her and her life around London. I really like this one. Miss Jabavu listens as dealer explains mechanical details. Scheduled to make first US visit this month in connection with the publishing of her book, she has traveled extensively in Africa and Europe. So this suggests that she had community in the US where she would have been going to speak about her book. Yeah?
I'm trying to figure out what are the dates here?
So this is 1962. So this is after her first book and when she gets appointed. So she does the editing 61 and 62.
So she would be how old?
Oh, my maths. Is it? She would have been 100 this year. 62, she would have been, I don't know, I'm too lazy to count. 29, 39, 49, 59, 69. Yeah, in her 40s. In her flat, in her bachelor flat of Thembi, New Strand editor sits casually on the floor working on her next editorial while her daughter holds phone chat with friend. Tembe was educated at the same private school which her mother attended, hopes to become a journalist too. And then it's a picture of her and Michael Cadbury Crossfield in their home in Jamaica. In Jamaica, at their beach cottage outside Kingston, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Crossfield contemplate dipping in the swimming pool during the editor's visit to islands between New Strand deadlines. And then just a comment on their marriage. And then during a TV interview, editor discusses her book Drawn in Color with Tom Dryberg and literary TV personality J.W. Lambert book, which was published in England in 1960 and a year later in Italy, will soon be published in the US and Holland. So, I don't know if I want to go there. So I thought we could read from some extracts from the book, but before we do that, I asked everyone to take a look at Walker. I've been trying to collect this other ideas about black women artists, and the version that you have is different from mine, so I'm not sure what page number it is. Read a few extracts from it. The third page, maybe. So what did it mean for a black woman to be an artist in our grandmother's time, in our great-grandmother's day? It is a question with an answer cruel enough to stop the blood. Did you have a grandmother who died under some ignorant and depraved white overseer's lash? Or was she required to bake biscuits for a lazy backwater tramp when she cried out in her soul to paint watercolors of sunsets or the rain falling on the green and peaceful pasture lands? Or was her body broken and forced to bear children who were more often than not sold away from her? 8, 10, 15, 20 children, when her own joy was the thought of modeling heroic figures of rebellion in stone or clay. How was the creativity of the black woman kept alive, year after year, century after century, when for most of the years black people have been in America, it was a punishable crime for a person to read or write, and the freedom to paint, to sculpt, to expand the mind with action did not exist. Consider, if you can bear to imagine, what might have been the result if singing too had been forbidden by the law. And I like this essay because it gets us to think about the life that Nonie Jabavu lived in contrast to what most black women across the world, in a sense, have had to deal with, and kind of highlight the privilege, maybe not use the word elitism, the privilege of what it meant for Nonie Jabavu to be able to do this with her life. That it comes in conversation with a tradition of black women, either, and people refer a lot to the Black Atlantic because of the conversations between the Black Atlantic and Africa, and the Black Atlantic and the Caribbean and the UK, and what it meant to publish a book before even the women's press was, or the feminist press was something, was a reality. So it places that in a really privileged position, which question came up yesterday, how do we read it in contemporary time? So, yesterday we spoke a bit about I'm going to start with Drawn in Color. We read it from the author, people who don't have a copy. The Drawn in Color is the first book, and for anyone who's got the book, you'll notice that she kind of puts a map. And already I think this positions us and tells us who her readership is. Are they African people? Why is she putting a map in the front of the book? Why is she locating herself geographically? And when I spoke about her, in fact, for republication, people are thinking, would you reprint this map as it is right now if you were introducing her book again? Because people would get very upset if anything about, Tanganyika, Salisbury was printed in South Africa today. But this is how she wanted to position herself. So it's a debate again about how do we make sense of her if we want her voice and her writing to become relevant in South Africa again. So most of the countries in this map are still French West Africa, Union of South Africa, Southwest Africa, Bechuanaland, Belgian Congo, Tanganyika, and northern Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia. So you get the sense of her locating herself within the colonial geography, rather than an African geography, perhaps. So, just to say, this book is the book she writes. She's reflecting on what it meant to have come home for her brother's funeral, and because her sister lived in Uganda, was unable to come to the funeral, and the family was very worried about the sister who didn't come to the funeral because they had sent a telegram. And so the trip is about her arriving home and then being sent as an emissary on behalf of the family to go and find out what has happened to her sister. And the second half of the book is basically her in Uganda, and she constantly refers to the Ugandans as Easterners and the South Africans as. I've spoken to some Ugandan friends, and they find this book highly offensive because of the way in which she writes about the Ugandans, especially. This strange comparison, and some people could kind of say, though, this is the precursor to, because her father has this idea of when he visited Uganda, there were people who had land, there were people who were just on the cusp of independence, and so in his mind, they are the ideal. And then she arrives there and she's like, this is weird. Why are they still living like this? And so you get this strange contrast, and for her identity as a Southerner in relation to another African identity as Easterners. And people are the conversations I've been having with people is, why does she position herself in that way? Is because her primary identity is then being English, and is she traveling as an African in Africa, or is she traveling as an Englishwoman in Africa, which takes on two different discourses, in a sense. Author's note, she says, I belong to two worlds with two loyalties. South Africa, where I was born, and England, where I was educated. A cable sent by my father from my home in South Africa, I flew back there to be amongst my Bantu people, leaving my English husband behind in London. Later that year, he and I went to live in East Africa to be near my only sister who had married out there. I have told here something of my own background and circumstances, since this is a personal account of an individual African's experience and impressions of the differences between East and South Africa in their contact with Westernization. Now that immediately positions, and for me, what I find really interesting is that she positions herself as an individual African experience. But that's not really what we end up reading, because would an African refer to other Africans as Easterners? And then she kind of says the impressions and differences between East and South Africa in their contact with Westernization. She uses the word Westernization rather than colonialism. And why the need to position them in relation to Westernization? Why couldn't it simply be an exploration of going to another African country for however many times she's been traveling? And again, she uses the word Bantu. And I don't know if anyone in the room, I've been trying to trace when was the first time this word Bantu became used, and when did we decide not to use it anymore? And for me, it reminds me of the word in African America, for African Americans, Negro, right? And how that word has evolved over time. So there's a woman, Margot Jefferson, who writes a beautiful memoir called Negroland. And when I read that book, it got me thinking about this word Bantu. So in 1960, Nonie Jabavu talks about my Bantu people. We have the newspaper, the Bantu World. So it takes on a particular kind of identity of blackness. And then when did we decide to not use that word and use black? And obviously, we trace that perhaps to the black. Why have I forgotten the word? It starts with an N. Sengo, negritude, thank you. And you could think about what that means in relation to negritude and the conversations across the continent about what blackness means in this conversation with modernity, colonization, westernization. So for her to say, my Bantu people, leaving my English husband behind in London, again, she's in conversation with these identities. And then I think, again, for what this means for a contemporary Bantu again. I don't know how many of you have heard about a Bantu book festival and black people creating spaces for themselves only and evoking that word Bantu, again, Singa Bantu, and how perhaps it's different when you use it in relation to bantu as undu in an African context, and what it means when an English speaker is perhaps using the word. And so I'm just exploring the language and how language is an interesting way for us to position ourselves, and she does this in the author's note. And then I'm not going to read it, but the acknowledgements are really interesting. Again, this question of who were her people. And she lists really interesting people. So my favorite is when she talks about Robert Graves, who was a famous writer in the UK. And she says, I thank them, Robert Graves, who invited me to stay with him and his family in Maloka. I don't know how to pronounce it. Peaceful peace and quiet during the last arduous weeks of typing. So you get a sense that they have a good relationship. And who is this black woman who has a good relationship with Robert Graves? What does it take for you to get to that kind of inner circle? Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. And then she continues and refers to a Baroness Ravensdale, and then a Norman Prouting, and kind of lists the Honourable Anthony Gregg. And these are people with titles. And it's significant that she highlights these people. And I think it's only in her second book where she refers to people from South Africa. So there are no South Africans, as far as I can see, the people that are in this acknowledgements. And again, that's interesting. Who were her people in South Africa? If in her acknowledgements, she's talking about her inner circle, a very elite inner circle, middle class or upper middle class inner circle in the UK. So, are there any comments so far? Or any questions? People who've read the book. Yeah. Yeah, so that's the conversation, and I've been trying to ask historians. I suspect, from the little reading that I've done, is that it comes way before with far more positive. So in Xhosa, for example, and so it was in the language. I don't know when it became pejorative. And that's perhaps the conversation that we're having. But does it really become pejorative if there's a whole newspaper named after it and the newspaper has a particular kind of readership in South Africa? And what does it mean for Nguni languages? So, Zulu, I don't know if there are any traces in Kiswahili, but it's a word, and the root of it, ntu, you'll find it in a lot of words in Nguni languages as well. So I think it actually comes from African languages and kind of was adopted and changed over time, which is the nature of language. Yeah.
Yes, I think one reason why it became pejorative was that the government began to use it as a description, and you could trace the name changes through censuses. So, it's one quick way of seeing
Yes.
when they begin to use the term Bantu as the official term.
Sure.
I think if I might say, I think you should look very carefully at the because liberal set of people, greatest authors of the early 20th century, and he would have been extremely liberal. Mr. Briggs had been a type of Lord Altrincham, and he opposed all sorts of things again, extremely liberal. So the people she was mixing with, particularly Europeanized person, so she's absorbed into it, there's no pressure against her, she's welcomed by them all, but I think you really need to look at that framework of people she's friendly with, because they are reaching out to her and welcoming her, because there were people in England, not all of them, who were very, very liberal and wished it was part of being an active member of the academic Labour Party, and they would have welcomed her and really enjoyed her. So, very carefully. And also Mr. Briggs, who had and then resigned from the peerage because he was so liberal too. Certainly, I think that influence.
Yeah, so I think,
You can't just say that it's a political issue. Would
you and no.
You know nothing about Robert Graves. Look up his biography and see what he did for people, because you're making an assumption which is not correct.
I think you're getting upset because you are upset, ma'am.
I'm observing something because I know a lot about what happened in England in that time, in the liberal world.
And I'm also observing that the minute I mention the colonialism, taken on a particular posture. Okay, thank you. It's going to become very difficult. And I've had a really difficult day already, but I can see that you're visibly upset. You're annoyed. And you now want to change this conversation into about the white liberals and changing the gays and to... Thank you. I think everybody does want to hear about Nonie, and can we just change the gays a bit? Because I think yesterday you were here and we spoke about the complicated relationship that she does have with links that her father actually established. So friendships with people like the Crossfields and the Cadburys. It's complicated, and no one's doubting that. And I don't think we can isolate or talk about liberals without talking about colonialism. I think that's neither here nor there. The point is the project happened, and it happened in particular ways. And the books actually show us about the hybridity of Nonie Jabavu, that she's perfectly happy to dance between the two identities. And I think that's what's more interesting. I'm not trying to create binaries. I'm not trying to accuse anyone of anything. I'm just trying to explore what it means to be a particular kind of person at a particular time. And that's all that we're doing here. So can we change the gaze and just talk about me? Thank you. And I guess for me, the way she uses language, and I spoke about it yesterday in what she does in the author's notes, and so I'm just going to read an extract here. I'm reading from page 51 in this version, if people have it. And, sorry, I've just been like caught off guard. So, this is how her father talks about the Ugandans. Maybe let's just start there before we get and talk about the language issue. So, her father's talking about her visit to she's going to Uganda, and he's trying to prep her and kind of psych her up because he's quite well traveled and he's got connections. So interestingly, her sister is married to one of the first lawyers in Uganda, who had studied at Fort Hare under the tutelage of her father, and moves to Uganda. And so again, they were quite particular about who marries who. If you can imagine, any kind of typical elite family are very particular about the connections that you then establish. So for her father, here my father interrupted. Sorry, I'm starting page 49. Here my father interrupted, pointing to a pictorial calendar he had brought back some years before from a 10-day visit he had paid to Kenya and Uganda on his way home from a conference to which he had been invited in India. The picture was labeled His Highness the Kabaka and Nabagareka of Buganda, and he explained, Kabaka means king, Nabagareka, queen of Buganda. I saw them myself with my own eyes, those Baganda, my word. I saw Africans, black fellow Africans living in paradise. I tell you, in Uganda, black people own land. Own land? Yes, my father said. Their land is theirs. By title deed, there is no alienation in that country. Then indeed they are in heaven. There were exclamations, ejaculations, transports on all sides at this, and the big people went off at a familiar tangent on the theme of how we Southern Bantu had been deprived of land, living room, and how our beloved cattle can no longer roam. Not only that, but how the law requires that we reduce their numbers to a handful each man in place of the great herds of which ritual prestige and sheer love of the animals rendered the possession of glittering ambition. Natives must cull their stock, proclaims the Boer government, while we gaze with frustrated longing on the Europeans' only areas that once were ours and now may gaze and fatten only cattle that belong to that other race. We know about soil erosion because we have been educated about it and appreciate that that is the reason we must cull stock. On the other hand, deprived of cattle and also forbidden to do the best paid work available, where then, people asked, is meat and milk to be had. So I really like this extract because it does two things for me. It kind of positions her father's ideas about the Ugandans, and he doesn't even refer to them as the Easterners, he refers to them as the Ugandans, and kind of builds their esteem in terms of, look, they've got land, they've got royalty, something that was stripped away from us. And we were having a chat earlier, sorry, your name's Judith? No, Elizabeth. About this idea of, was she political? So what does it mean again for her to be quite pointed about the land question in South Africa in 1960, comparing it to the land question elsewhere and the identity. And she doesn't shirk away from it in the way that we would expect. For me, my interest in perhaps picking this extract is about the current conversations we're having about land, one. But two, this idea there were certain ideas that people were not allowed to talk about. And the candid way in which her father and her are having this conversation about their own experience in South Africa in relation to people elsewhere in the continent. There's another. Sure. Mm-hmm.
So what did she really know about the politics and the sort of atmosphere and the culture outside Africa, other than from the British experience?
Yeah. So if we use the two books and the columns, because those are the only, and the editorials perhaps, those are the only texts I could find directly that she writes about. So in both the books, in the second book we'll look at how the family spoke about, Verwoed's policies all the time. So when she comes home, I think that's her kind of dipping her foot back into the politics. But so she left at 13, comes back as an adult for various trips in and out, but only comes back to Africa as an adult in the 1980s. So I think there's a huge distance, and that's why the extracts from the 1982 version, she's very aware of it. And she says, I've actually lost out on 2 or perhaps 3 generations. She says, I've lost out on my generation, I've lost out on the generation of the children who come after me, and the 1976 generation. So she's very aware of it, and so that's, I think, part of the complication of, how do we read her and her own politics. And for me, I'm interested in the observer, so the insider-outsider identity that she has to take on. But in the 1982 one, she constantly talks about South Africa being home. So while she's roaming around the world, she still wants to kind of plant herself here and her primary identity here, which, I think we can sympathize with her as someone who was roaming around the world, especially when you then come back and you get told you're a foreigner in your own country. So, I don't know, I'm more sympathetic to her, but also the example I made yesterday, the 1977 columns, we'll see, what were her politics, and does she position herself as someone who's overtly political? And maybe it's just a matter of the culture of the liberal politics that she had taken on from her parents and her grandparents, because she comes from a tradition of overtly political figures. So her grandfather was overtly political, and the father was also overtly political. He was in the All-African Convention. Both of them were involved in that. So I don't know. It's not easy to pinpoint. Mm-hmm.
You get a sense of the second book that she picks up a lot of her political knowledge just from immersing herself with people.
Mm. Yeah, and I want to read some extracts from that book, but singing, and maybe back to, she talks about her father's relationship with Cecil John Rhodes. I'd imagine that's a very uncomfortable thing for people to imagine, or not, because if you remember her going to England, it's Jan Smuts who organizes the whole trip. So in tomorrow, one of the articles I'll bring, she calls him Oom Jan. So who gets to call the Jan Smuts oom, first of all, and his wife Tannie, and goes to the house. So the ship that takes her to England when she's 13-year-old leaves from Cape Town, and they go to Jan Smuts' house to stay there a few days before she goes to England. And the people who help her is the Clark family, Margaret Clark. And so again, and she writes about it in very candid ways, but she writes about her grandfather and Cecil John Rhodes. So she's talking about traveling through the Central African Federation. This is on page 72. Actually, I'll start on page 71 at the bottom. She says, "At last I was riding on the Cape to Cairo Railway. It had sounded so romantic in history class when I was a schoolgirl in history classes at Lovedale, near my old home at Fort Hare, when my father lectured there. Now, 20 years on, I savoured its actual romance as I chugged over mile upon mile of wooden sleepers and admired the efforts of our white settlers in linking up these far-flung countries. The railway was an idea of Cecil Rhodes. He had invited my grandfather to ride on it when it was inaugurated. It has not yet fulfilled Rhodes's dream, in which the line reached as far as Cairo. Nevertheless, even only to Salisbury was some 2,000 miles from Cape Town, and I could not but be impressed, as anyone must be who makes the journey. The train pressed on bravely through bush, aloes, thorns, and mopani trees, protea shrubs, tall grass. I noticed how the Rhodesian grass seemed taller than in the Transvaal." I mean, I'm not even going to try to unpack it. It's so juicy in terms of, hey, she doesn't critique the idea, which would be appalling to any contemporary black reader, perhaps, and I'm thinking of people from my generation, that, her grandfather was invited and he went and they explored this idea of the dream. She refers to it as a dream, not as conquest, which is the way in which the idea has been framed. So again, this kind of contradictory or complicated character who seems quite aware of her proximity to colonial power at the time, but not fully critiquing it in this instance. And again, the use of Rhodesian. I mean, if this was reprinted today, how many of these words would they have to change, or would they change them at all? And would it be fair to change them because it is her voice, after I see you shaking your head? Any other?
I might have to put in parentheses where it is now. Black woman standing.
Going to make many people uncomfortable. Extract, I want to talk about the pagan women. So they've arrived, and so the word pagan, no one uses that word. And I was very uncomfortable because I was teaching the other one. And she writes pagan as well in the other book because, as someone commented, she wants to immerse herself in people. So she's constantly like, I'm Xhosa, but there are these other Xhosas, and she kind of describes them in very exotic ways. The interaction of this middle class, Christianized, and the kind of interaction that she has. So they bump into this woman who is selling pickled pears or something. And they say to her, please can we have some of your pears? We're going to that house, so just walk to that house and we'll sort you out when we get there. And she kind of gets all up in arms, and she kind of describes her as, the pagan woman. And the word pagan, in my mind, I translate it into isiXhosa because we have words for making the distinctions between those who were Christianized and those who weren't Christianized. So pagan, in my mind, I say Igaba. Now, when you say it in isiXhosa, it doesn't sound as offensive when you talk about someone who's pagan. Although now people are saying we shouldn't use that word anymore. And Igaba referred to people who still put ochre on their faces. And that was a symbol of they haven't Christianized, they're resisting education. And so in her description of this woman, though, she almost tries to redeem her at the end, that she's not just a pagan woman, but she's someone who holds a lot of historical knowledge. And that her father, in fact, was quite prominent at the time. His research was about collecting clan names. And he said the only people you're going to find this oral history from are these pagans. So you, Nonie, think that you're smart and you just come from England and you're kind of dismissing this woman as just some rural woman who isn't smart. She holds a whole wealth of knowledge. And I like that interaction because it makes us think about her father, first of all, and how he dealt with her identity, and perhaps how he modeled this hybrid identity that they were trying to quite firmly grounded in African oral history, while at the same time speaking all these other languages, while at the same time being a Latin professor. Let me see. It's really, I just want to read it because it's really, really interesting. It's on page 29, I think. Okay, the pagan woman, page 28. The pagan woman started the recital of her clan names, and there were 3 more from where she had left off before. Magedigidi, Mafanelavele. That one made us smile and started to interrupt with comments, for it meant they who appear for no apparent reason. And when she had repetitiously exclaimed the reason for it until she was satisfied that we understood, there was a further little hold-up because my father repeated all of them after her and mistakenly chanted, Sokela, Mafanela Vele, Magidigidi. But the woman stopped him, protesting that he had fouled the order. He should say, Sokela, Magidigidi, Mafanela Vele, and lastly, Ndrongo Ndrongo. My father took great pains. At the end, he carefully folded up his files and squared them like a card play, slipped them into his waistcoat pocket, and then addressed the entire group. You see then, all of you good ladies here today, these clan names and praise names, zifumaneka nzima, kuba abanye abazazi. They are procured with extreme difficulty, for some do not know them. He talked solemnly of the passing into oblivion of our nationhood, our traditions, our background as people who had traveled from the far north, East Africa, about our Hamitic forefathers with their cattle, always searching for grasslands and mingling their blood with Bantu and Hottentot and Bushmen, and who knows what other peoples they went during those unknown centuries. For decades now, he had been trying to gather up what he could of known genealogies and praise, which often threw light on the journey and adventures of their owners' groups of forebears. In his travels up and down South Africa, on educational and political missions, at public gatherings, from agricultural shows, athletic sports displays, from concerts to religious gatherings, like revival meetings and chance encounters with strangers on trains and buses, he had carried on inquiries until at last he had published his findings in the book Imbumba Yamanyama, and he told the attention group. And so he goes on telling them about this book and the importance of collecting these histories and the importance of how they link us to the journey from East Africa. And perhaps that's the interest he had in visiting East Africa and befriending the East African students who had forte at the time, because there was a huge community of African students at the time. I won't read more from this just because of time. I also wanted to read from the Oka people. If there are any other comments?
It's atheist and pagan, and I think
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting iteration of the word, I think, that you're pointing out. And perhaps, again, we could go to the census and find out how that word was used and changed over time and who was counted as pagan and who wasn't. So this book was interesting for me because this year, Wits introduced it to first-year African literature students. And so I had to teach it. And so for the first time, about what does she mean in a contemporary audience? And so this one is divided into 3 parts: Middle Drift, Confluence Farm, and Johannesburg. And here in this book, not so much in that book, she uses the K word. And that got everyone all up in arms. And again, it's that question of when we reprint this, what are we going to do about it? Because no one wants to see that word in print again. But here, she uses it in a very interesting way, and I hope I can find the extract. But I was left with the question of, does she think of herself as the K word? And in the way that she writes about it here, I don't think she did. So she writes about a trip to a store, which was called I'm just going to say K word for the rest of it. K word, good store. That's what they were called. And she kind of describes the people in the shop bustling around, trying to negotiate prices with the store owner. And she's very particular about, they are there, and I am here wearing my suit and my gloves. I don't want to get myself dirty because they've got ochre on their faces, they've got ochre on their skirts. And it's just a very interesting way in which she positions herself again, because she understands the language, she understands and appreciates the history, but she's very clear about she's not pagan, they're pagan. She uses the K word quite frequently, in fact, in the book. Maybe it's a godsend that I can't actually find it. You can see I've got post-its everywhere. Yes, so I'm on page 63. Yes, 61. Yes, that's where I was going to start. Kaffir goods store, the sort where our servants buy yards of German, the cheap blue cotton print that they sew up into those graceful, voluminous skirts. There had been 2 or 3 such stores in Alice for as long as I could remember, but I had never set foot in them. As children of school, civilized people, our nannies or nurse girls kept a firm hold on us when out for walks and did not allow us to wander among the red-blanketed pagans who filled them. The imbola that they daub on themselves will dirty your clothes, and the language of those unconverted people is improper. So she kind of puts that in quotation marks. Yeah. But now, few, even among prim nannies, are ashamed of or despise the pagan half of the nation. My father's attitude towards them had not undergone any change, however, for he had always said, they are the fountain of Xhosa life and language custom, and of him they in turn said he was a lover of the people. Other sophisticates had caught up with him thanks to apartheid, which was imbuing everyone with national consciousness. Uferwood was closing the ranks and divisions. It was thanks to him that I drew no glances of curiosity when I arrived at the most popular Kaffir store in town. And it's kind of very matter of fact, So the Wit students were very up in arm about that, to the point where only 3 of them wrote the essay in the exam, because I think they were just quite over her and her coconutty ways, as they said. And again, page 63, it comes up a few times. And it's quite interesting, perhaps, the relationship and the picture that she's painting of the store. First of all, who owns the store? I think we're quite clear of who owns the store, who's buying from the store, and what is being sold at the store. So what I found particularly interesting here was what we now call Xhosa, so what we now call mbhaco, the Xhosa skirts. It's Manchester twill. So the fact it's from Manchester, but we're now using it and saying that is our traditional way. And I was caught up in a conversation about cultural appropriation, about what does it mean that the Sotho blankets come from the UK, mbhaco comes from Manchester twill, German print, what Makotis wear, the shweshwe, we call it shweshwe, is from Germany. It came with the German missionaries, but we take it on as our traditional garb. And those are really uncomfortable conversations to have with people about what is an African identity, because this and many other examples show us that, was it an equal exchange? Possibly not, obviously, but how did people then interpret them wearing German skirts? And the German print, we call it the Germane in Xhosa. It's still used, and then it was associated with pagan women. Again, she kind of refers to them over and over again. But now, it's associated with very high-end clothing lines, where you can buy a dress made in shweshwe for a pretty penny. There's a beautiful brand I follow on Instagram called Kosi, and you'll find her shop her label in Designers Emporium or something, for a couple of thousands. And it's just like the trajectory of what does that fabric mean, who gets to use it, and how it's remained in our cultural imagination in a sense. But here, it was perfectly only for the pagan women. Any questions? I was told to leave 15 minutes worth of questions.
Rural people used to wear red blanket outfits, with black edging and that sort of thing. Don't they wear it in Troy?
It's very rare. So the fabric, I found kind of old anthropological books. So it was the transition from ifele, what do you call? Thank you. Yes, hide. The transition from ifele, where you put ochre on it to turn it into the orange, to when people did away with the hide, because I'd imagine after the cattle killings, no one had any cattle, so you couldn't use that for your clothes anymore. And then you had to kind of take on other fabrics. So it's no longer dyed with ochre. You buy it dyed. Some of it is made in China. But you buy it already in red, you get it in blue, you get it in green, you get it in white, you get it in all sorts of colors. So people wear, I've got a few skirts, and every time I wear it, people are like, what's the occasion? I'm like, I just wanted to wear it. So it's still associated with either special occasions or rural people. But when I go to rural areas, I don't see anyone wearing it. It's for special occasions now. And it's a costume, I think. And that's just me just being pejorative because of this idea of, even black people ask me, what's the occasion? I'm like, I wanted to wear it, but it evokes something in people's cultural imagination.
You see, because the people of the red blanket people were very fussy about what they wore. And a friend of mine had a clothing store during the war, and she says the binding that they put on edges was not available, so they bought roll of black material. And she says the ladies would come and they'd take the roll outside and look at it through the sun at it. And they didn't sell 1 inch because it was such inferior quality.
So it's also very particular. So it then took on other symbols. So depending on the design you had of the braiding, people could tell where you were from. Whether you were married or not. So I think it's the beadwork too would tell whether you're married, where you are in your initiation, which group you come from, all of it. So it was very symbolic, which is again why it's interesting when it shows up in cultural or contemporary culture. There are certain items that are only supposed to be worn by pregnant women, for example, and kind of people are wearing it with jeans and there's one that only if you're breastfeeding you wear it. And so, every culture has kind of symbols of who you are based on your clothes. But over time, it's become meaningless. And Nonie Jabavu, one of the columns we'll look at tomorrow, hopefully I've got it, writes about seeing, so this would be in 1977, still seeing people kind of wearing that in town and how regal they look and how sophisticated the women are. So it's a change, in fact, from what she's writing here. Because now she's observing them, and maybe it's because of the long distance that she's been away from home that she's starting to view them in a particular way. But yeah, I just find it interesting how it changes over time.
I wonder how she managed to keep up her Xhosa language living in England with not surrounded by an English husband and
understand it and speak it. The father.
So the only evidence I found to help with the question, because I was also quite curious, even though in both the books, which she writes as an adult, obviously she kind of intersperses it because she says, well, it's close as legal, you can't translate it's close. There's an article in 1935 that I found in the Bantu World. So Frida Matthews, her aunt, had gone to Frida Bokwe, marries Z.K. Matthews. Z.K. Matthews goes to LSE for a year, and so Frida goes with him. And so she's writing to the Bantu World, telling the readers about her wonderful trip in London. And so it's like a review. This is who I met, this is where we went, and one of the people she met was Nonie Jabavu. So in 1935, she would have been 15, 16. mentions, she's quite particular about her Xhosa is now faltering. So already, having been in England for 3 to 4 years, obviously she was the only black child in York. And so who is she going to speak with? And the language begins to falter. So I'd be interested in who perhaps did help her, because some of the translations that she uses in both her books are quite sophisticated in the sense, but she belabors this idea of like formal language of isiXhosa, and the phrases that she uses are quite difficult to translate, and many of them we don't use as often. So someone was saying, because of the way she writes in English, you can imagine that her family probably spoke a Victorian version of Xhosa, so what we call Xhosa A, where it's like proper Xhosa, and not like the funny one that I speak, which is definitely not the kind of Xhosa her dad. Yes, which is very, so the A.C.K. Mkhayis would have written in that Xhosa, the deals as the A.C. Jordan's Ingboye Minyanya is where I was just like, oh my gosh, this is like Shakespeare in his Xhosa. Which is very, so it's very different. So I suspect, and it's only a hunch, we can't really prove it until someone tells us, that someone must have helped her by the time she got to these books. Or maybe because she was coming home more often, she then was able to read her father's stuff and it jogged the memory. There's the various ways we can think of it.
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
Her daughter, would she have spoken Xhosa to her daughter? And what happened to her daughter? Because the daughter is very interesting. I mean, surely as a mother, she would have taught her a mother tongue. So that's how she kept her language going.
I don't know. I've never really thought about that. But her daughter also died quite young. I don't know if she died before Nonie Jabavu. She would have died before Nonie Jabavu, yes. So there's very little information about her. I've only seen a picture of her in the Ebony magazine that I showed you, and she had a son. But I was saying to a few people who stayed over yesterday, there's a whole other scandal and a story about her daughter and her relationship that by the time, who was telling me, by the time she died, they were not talking to each other. Yeah. So I want to tell them who you are. Sure. Just one moment, sir. Pardon?
This is the university summer school.
Yes.
I'd like to ask a simple question instead of an academic thing. What do you think about the quality of the writing?
Her writing?
Yeah.
I think she writes pretty well. So I was talking to a friend of mine who's also a writer. She's very formal. And I think it kind of speaks to the language that she would have been exposed to, having gone to England, having come from an elite family. So I don't think it's uncharacteristic of the time and her exposure and her way of being. I guess it's not out of sync with who she was. I don't know if that answers your question. Have you read the book, and what do you think of the writing?
Yeah.
And what do you think of the writing?
What do you think of it?
I think scanning things did right in 1960. Right?
Oh.
And the courage to write that themselves is not for English and an international audience is amazing.
So I wanted to do a plug because we have someone who's kind of featured in the book in a very weird way. So your grandfather, so your name is?
My name's Karidwin.
You can tell the story.
In chapter 3, I believe,
This one.
exploring as much as I can about the family and about, the
Old friend, a man in my position. So you get the sense of Mr. Bill and Mr. Jabavu being really good friends. Yeah.
a few years ago and met Professor Jabavu's stepdaughter, and she's still alive, well, at the time is still alive. I haven't checked in with her.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, there's a whole chapter dedicated to her grandfather.